morning, everyone. Before we get started, I'd just like to encourage any of you who'd like to move up closer to the front that you're very welcome to. I think we're going to have a very interesting conversation, and the closer you are, the better you'll be able to enjoy it. Excellent. So many people cooperating, moving up. I am Betty Frank Bailey and a member of the board of the Town Affairs Council here in Chilmark, and I am delighted to welcome you all to the Book Festival and delighted to thank all of you who have been supporting the Book Festival. It is free, and the way that we make it a successful event is through our sponsors, both individuals and corporations, and any donations. So we greatly appreciate those. I'd like to just let you know that we will be taking a few questions at the end of the discussion this morning, so you're welcome to step up towards the mic towards the end of the discussion. You'll probably be invited up by our moderator. Today, our moderator is Ruth Faden, and I'll just take a moment to introduce her to you. She is a bioethicist and the founding director of Johns Hopkins Berman Institute of Bioethics, an international expert on the ethics of science, global justice, and food policy. Dr. Faden is the author and editor of many books and articles on biomedical ethics, health policy, and has also served on numerous national advisory committees and commissions. And she is also, I'm happy to say, a wonderful neighbor. So I'll turn it over to Ruth.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for that. I see some other wonderful neighbors in the audience, and that's just great, and some dear friends, too. So it's my pleasure to moderate this panel. Here's how it's going to go. I'm going to introduce Dani in just a moment. I'm going to ask Dani to introduce Inheritance, her extraordinary memoir. Then I'm going to kick off discussion. I've got some questions for Dani. Actually, I have 5 questions for Dani, but they're big ones. And hopefully we will have time for you to ask your questions. And we're going to do all of this in 45 minutes. Can you all hear me? Yeah, can we do it in 45 minutes? Great. Remind me if you can't, because I always forget to hold the mic up high enough. All right. Dani Shapiro is a prolific and extraordinarily talented writer. Inheritance, which debuted at number 11 on the New York Times bestseller list, is Dani's 10th book and her 5th memoir. Her other memoirs include Devotion, which is about her spiritual search as she becomes disillusioned with the Orthodox Judaism tradition in which she was raised, and another memoir, Slow Motion, also very compelling, they're all very compelling, on the challenges of marriage. Dani's essays and short fiction pieces have appeared in The New Yorker, in Elle, in Vogue, in O, on the op-ed pages of The New York Times, and in the New York Times Book Review. Dani is also a lovely person and a wonderful conversationalist, as we are all about to experience. So with that, join me in welcoming Dani to our festival. Dani, can you orient the audience to Inheritance, please?
Can you all hear me? Great. Before I do, it's an honor to be in conversation with you. Some of my favorite conversations about Inheritance have been with bioethicists who have thought so deeply about what's turned out to be my life story. So, who knew? Just briefly, so in June of 2016, I made the discovery through very casually having submitted my DNA to one of those over-the-counter DNA testing sites, really just because my husband was doing it and he asked me if I wanted to do it too. And when my results came back, it took several steps to come to understand that the dad who raised me, who I was extremely close to, really had a soul connection with, and who died when I was 23 years old, and who really was my lodestar, both as a human being and as a writer. Many of my books were dedicated to him, and in some way or another were about him. And also my novels, my fiction was tended to revolve around family secrets for reasons that I didn't know or think too much about or understand. I found out that he had not been my biological father, and that my parents had trouble conceiving and had gone to an institute where donor sperm was used. This was in the early 1960s, and that I came to the shocking, initially crushing, very complex realization that not only was my father not my biological father, but that my biological father must have been a sperm donor. And that's where the book really opens. Should I say more? Okay, I'm done.
I mean, there's a lot more to be said, but hopefully it'll be a bit revealed in conversation. So one of the notes to us from the wonderful organizers of the festival was if there was something personal you wanted to say about why the book is important to you, take a minute and say it. So I'm going to take literally a minute to say that as a way of asking each of you to connect personally. I'm guessing many of you will, in one way or another, with the themes that Dani so beautifully discusses in her book. Memoirs are, of course, deeply personal for the author. That's the nature of memoirs. But a really good memoir ends up being, I believe, deeply personal for the reader as well. And certainly I found myself again and again in the pages of Inheritance. As I mentioned to Dani, the legendary Orthodox giants, Rabbi Soloveitchik and Rabbi Schneerson, who were so central to Dani's cultural inheritance, were huge figures in my upbringing as well. My parents, especially my mother, struggled with questions of appearance and identity and loyalty. And as a consequence, I came to realize in reading Inheritance, so have I, actually. And of course, as has already been mentioned, bioethics is my day job. And this book takes on so many of the big issues that we deal with in our field having to do with the ethics of reproductive technologies, and also, obviously, with advances in genetics and genomics. So I thank Sue Ellen, and I thank my dear friend Wendy for hooking me up with this book and this author. It couldn't have been a better match, so thank you for that. Okay, Dani, we have so much we could explore. As time permits, I'd like to ask Dani one question in each of 5 themes that emerged as important to me as I read the book. So here are the 5 themes. I'm sort of setting you up so you know what's coming, too. The first theme is identity, appearance, and belonging. The second theme is the perniciousness of secrets. The third theme is the meaning of parenthood, the parent-child relationship, and of family. The second theme is whether we can, and if we can, how should we judge the past. And the last theme has to do with the contemporary dilemmas facing donor-conceived people today and the practice of donor conception. So we'll go from the past, end in the present, and then open it up for your questions. So first, identity, appearance, and belonging. Dani, you write that from the time you were very small, you were told that you don't look Jewish. Okay? And that when you were very young, you used to look in the mirror, look up really close as a child to try to find the truth of yourself. Could you speak a little bit about how that confusing sort of truth was changed, altered, when you learned about your biological origins?
Almost instantly, there was a sense that I had, through all the shock and everything else that I was feeling, of, oh, that makes sense. I had fought so hard against those comments, which were daily comments, and I didn't actually think they affected me. As a child and as a young woman. I really didn't. I had such defenses against them that when people would say to me, really every day, you don't look Jewish, you can't possibly be Jewish. Sometimes they said it aggressively, sometimes they were puzzled, sometimes it was casual, but it was said constantly. I always pushed back against that with raised kosher, 2 sinks, 2 dishwashers, spoke fluent Hebrew, went to a yeshiva, my whole impeccable family history. And the feeling of the realization that both that I had worked so hard to not, when somebody says something to you enough times, when enough people say something to you enough times, there's probably some truth in it somewhere, but it was dangerous for me to consider what that might mean. And so just really briefly, I remember at some point as I was working on inheritance and I was just on this deep inward path to try to understand, I was at a dinner, a black tie dinner in New York City that was honoring a friend of mine, and it was being sponsored by the Jewish Week, which is a very Jewish publication, and everyone in the room was Jewish. And I had gone up to the bar to get a drink, and it was in one of those old hotels where there's kind of a modeled mirror behind the bar, and I caught a glimpse of myself. And for the first time in my life, I saw myself the way other people had seen me, and I thought, oh, that's what they've seen. Because my biological father, as it turns out, was Western European, and I happened to look like him. So it was actually a comfort to finally understand this piece of me that just seemed very strange, and a subtle disconnect that made me feel like I didn't belong. It made me feel like an outsider, and yet I was so much of an insider, as far as I knew, that why would I possibly be feeling that way? And yeah, I think this is going to lead to your next question, so I'll stop.
It is.
Okay.
I think it is. So it is a little bit. I have a tough job as a moderator. I could listen to Dani like endlessly, but I also know we have to move on and ask another question. So good cue. Thank you. Appreciate it. I have an anecdote about not looking Jewish, which maybe in Q&A I'll raise. A friend of mine happened to a friend of mine in college, but I'll move on. All right, perniciousness of secrets. Dani has already signaled to us that secrets have been a theme in her writing. Certainly, secrets, huge part of inheritance. And I just want to quote 2 lines from the end of part 1, and I don't think there's a spoiler in here, really. It's not a spoiler-ish type book. The wind is welcome, but it's blowing away my notes, so I'm going to hold on here. And here's what Dani writes at the end of part 1. All my life, I had known there was a secret. What I hadn't known, the secret was me. And that line really stopped me when I got to it. I wonder if you could say a bit more about that, about whether there were lots of other secrets, or whether that was really the big secret, and also, as some might challenge you, aren't some secrets okay to keep in families?
So why don't I begin with the last thing that you said? Because that definitely is a challenge that I get. Why does it matter? What good is knowing? Let sleeping dogs lie, that kind of thing. So to go back to that feeling that I had as a child, of feeling like an outsider, feeling like something didn't add up, snooping all the time, looking through my parents' things whenever I could, which I know a lot of kids do, but there was greater purpose somehow to my snooping, in the same way as there was greater purpose to my staring at my face in the mirror and trying to understand it. Lots of kids do that. I was doing it differently. When a child grows up with that feeling, and not knowing why, that child tends to turn those feelings against herself. I grew up, many people do grow up not knowing where they come from, right? But they know that they don't know, which is one of the huge difference between adoptees who have always known that they were adopted, and the hundreds of thousands of people now who are discovering that they were donor conceived, because it was, and sometimes still is, kept a secret. I know we'll get to that. But that feeling of, I realize now that I was formed by not knowing and not knowing that I didn't know. And if you think about that, that information is foundational. And if you don't have that kind of foundational information, on some level, you know it. And so on the deepest level, there was this sense of that disconnect, and that was very formative for me. The line about, I always knew there was a secret, what I didn't know the secret was me, the book festival organizers in their infinite wisdom actually put that on some of the water bottles, just so you know. All the water bottles have quotes from the authors. It's the coolest thing. But my water bottle says that. This is the first water bottle I'm actually taking home from a festival in a really long time. I mean, authors usually keep those in, like, leave them in the room. There's no room in the suitcase. I have to take that one home.
So I have to say it's totally coincidence. I did not.
Yeah, I figured you didn't know.
No, I did not conspire with the organizers to pick that sentence. Okay.
But in terms of that, I supplied narratives all my life, and all my life as a writer, for the secrets. And they were all true. I mean, my parents did keep secrets. There were secrets about previous marriages. There were secrets about the pain that they were in. There were secrets about my father's health. There were secrets. And, eventually I knew most of them, and I was pretty sure that I understood, I supplied, they're within the pages of earlier books of mine. I wrote an entire New Yorker personal history piece about a secret of my father's that I discovered. And all of those narratives are still true, but they weren't the whole truth. I was like missing the big kahuna.
And there it was.
Yeah.
And there it was. So, from that secret from those secrets, I should say, to the meaning of parenthood, the parent-child relationship, and of family. There are times in inheritance, not all the way through, but times when it seems as if you are privileging biology or putting a primacy on biology in defining family relationships. Adoptive parents, devoted step-parents might feel threatened, disturbed, maybe offended by some of what you write in Parts of Inheritance. What do you say to them?
It does come up precisely in that way. And I've been traveling since January when the book came out. And inevitably during the Q&A, often an adoptive parent will get off, often an adoptive parent who hasn't read the book yet, or is only kind of seeing certain parts of the book be like sort of coming at them in almost neon. What I say is, did your kids know that they were adopted? Yes, always. It was always part of the fabric of their identity. So your kids grew up knowing what they didn't know. What I am really sort of attacking, if I attack anything in the book, is the perniciousness of secrets being kept. And regarding biology, my mother, who is in fact my biological mother, I actually confirmed that after my first discovery, and had an elderly cousin take a DNA test, had her son drive over to her house and like teach her how to spit into the plastic vial and do the whole thing, because I really thought, I need a tent pole, I didn't know. So my mother is my biological mother. I was not close to her, and I am unlike her. I am really fundamentally unlike her, and I always have been. I was very much like my father. And that is my argument to anyone who thinks that in any way I'm privileging biology, because the journey in the book, for me emotionally, was one of making this shocking discovery, realizing that a huge secret had been kept from me all my life, realizing that I had been giving incorrect medical history to doctors confidently all my life, for myself and for my child, and the sense of betrayal and all that. When people would say to me very early on, in a very facile way, meaning well, they would say, well, no matter what, your father's still your father. And I thought, stand in my shoes for a minute. Think about what it would be like to suddenly discover that that's not the case, having never known it. It's a big deal. It's a bigger deal to some than others. I was so connected to my father's family history, to the Shapiro ancestors, going back to those rabbis that you referenced, that it really felt like, well, what does it mean in ancestry? Biological connection does matter. That's actually what it is, that is to be an ancestor. And my set of ancestors, it turned out, were not those folks from the shtetls of Eastern Europe. They were from here, actually. pretty much from an island right nearby, and came over on one of those ships. So talk about like, so no, I don't feel that I do that at all. The journey was one of coming back to a place very, very powerfully of feeling that absolutely, yes, my father is still my father, perhaps even more my father, because what he did in order to be able to have me, for me to exist, was a very brave, very hard thing to do back then.
So you've sort of answered a piece of my next question. When Dani learns this, you've got to make sense of what people did 50 years ago, 54 years ago, in fact, and a little before that. So it's what your mother did, what your father did, what Edmund Ferris did, who is the person who ran the clinic where Dani was conceived, what your biological father did, all of this 50 plus years ago. In my world, we call this retrospective moral judgment. How do you look back at something that occurred decades and decades and decades ago and draw any inferences, make any conclusions about the morality, right, of what these other people did in this other time, if not this different, even if it's the same place. So could you talk to us about whether you struggled with that, how you struggled with that, what conclusions you reached?
I love that question, and I did struggle with that. I grappled with that. Both of my parents were gone. My mother had passed away 15 years earlier, and as I mentioned, my father had died when I was 23. And so there was no one with direct knowledge that I could question, as is coming up very often, where people do make these discoveries and their parents are still living. That's its own level of discomfort. I had mine. So I used all of my capacities and skills as someone who has reported in the past and dove into the history of reproductive medicine in this country. And it was a very uncomfortable place. There was a lot of what can really only be thought of today as eugenics. There was a list that I came across of characteristics that would be optimal in a sperm donor, and it was things like should be of sound character, should be a man of medicine or science, should be of fine physical stock, free of allergies or any hereditary taints. I mean, I guess I've memorized it. It was so horrifying. I found myself reading the material of that time, and I could only read it a little bit at a time because it was so disconcerting also to feel that I came from that thinking. However, I also steeped myself in the world of my parents. What was it to be a childless couple in the late 1950s and early 1960s? It was a late marriage for both of my parents. They had each been previously married, and my father was Orthodox. You know, in the 5 years that my parents tried to have a child, his younger brother and his wife had 4 children. You know, what would that have felt like? His younger sister had 4 children. Be fruitful and multiply is literally the, like, you know, in Hebrew it's pru urevu. Be fruitful and multiply. It's like the commandment. And I thought about male infertility and how shameful that was. It was so shameful that guess what? It didn't exist. No doctors tested for it, when in fact it's the easiest thing, much easier to test for male infertility than female infertility. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? Edward Albee's play was opening on Broadway. That was the depiction of a childless couple and what they do to each other. And so what I actually had to do, and it was an extraordinary opportunity, though it was very hard at the time, was imagine my parents as people before me. You know, we don't often have an opportunity or a reason to do that in our lives. And I had to think of them as them. And what it ultimately did for me, I mean, for those of you who have read some of my other work, you know, my compassion for my mother has been in short order, and I have more now. I've had endless stores of compassion for my father, and I have even more now. But I had to actually really think, what was it to be them, not from the lens of, my God, this is psychologically, morally corrupt. We know that secrets do hurt us for the most part, which we can get to, or, I mean, we'll talk, and we know that, you know, the whole idea of what the child doesn't know won't hurt them, not so true. We know that medical history, genetic history is important and that people should have a right to it if it's possible, and that there should be kind of open communication between parents and children. We know that now, but they didn't know that then. And also, doctors were gods. Right, so you're wearing a white coat, someone's got a white coat in the room, and that person is saying, go home and never tell a soul, don't tell your own parents, don't tell your OBGYN, don't tell your siblings, no one will ever know. The birth certificate will essentially be a false document. They never would have said that, but that would be the case. You know, it had only been 9 years since DNA had been discovered. The idea that there could ever be a future in which we would be sitting here having this conversation would have been the stuff of complete science fiction. And, you know, Jonas Salk had only recently, you know, discovered the cure for polio. Doctors were gods, and when doctors believed in keeping secrets. So this is the culture in which I was born. So I don't feel, including my feelings to the doctors and to the authors of these texts, I don't feel anger toward them. I did, but I don't, because they were products of their time, and to see that through a presentist lens or through retrospective moral judgment, I think is to not see in the fullness of time what that was.
I wonder if you would say a moment about the use of the word treatment as a euphemism, and also the practice of mixing sperm.
Yeah.
I think that would be helpful for people to understand.
So one of the things that I discovered, and I was able to interview and speak with elderly doctors, endocrinologists, people who knew the scientist who was the head of the institute where I was conceived, and people who were involved in that world in general, is that an infertile couple coming to an institute known for donor sperm would be told that it was a treatment that would help them, very gentle, innocuous word, that it would help boost their chances. I mean, the image that I always have of that is like a football game where, you know, so they would mix the intended father's sperm with the healthy sperm of a young donor. And they would say, this young, healthy sperm will help boost your chances of having your own child. Well, we really know differently, but that would have been something to hold on to. And then something that I discovered later, because my research continues, and I discovered it after I finished Inheritance. I was able to speak to a woman in her 80s who conceived her children at the same institute where I was conceived the same year. And she was very clear in her memories, which many, many women are not, because they were able to kind of
change their memory.
Change their memory, exactly. It was encouraged. Yeah. This woman told me that when a woman would become successfully pregnant at this institute, this was her experience, that she got the phone call saying, congratulations, Mrs. So-and-so, you're pregnant. But it's so interesting, the blood levels show that you must have already been pregnant when you got here. So depending on your relationship to reality, your level of trauma, your desire to forget, and to really explode this information into nothingness, it was possible to do that.
So can I ask you in the end, what do you believe your parents believed?
I'll preface that by saying that I have to be comfortable with that I will never fully know. So, you know, I had a lot of narratives I was certain of up until June of 2016, and I will never be certain of any narrative ever again, which is actually kind of a gift. I've come to see it as a gift. But what I strongly suspect is that my parents initially went to the Ferris Institute trying to have their own child. That Edmund Ferris would have looked at my father's sperm and realized it wasn't possible. He would have introduced the idea of this treatment. I was told by the woman I spoke with that parents, she said no couple coming here would have come not knowing what they were here for. You had to sign on the dotted line. They would match blood type. People knew what they were doing, and then all these pains were taken to make them forget. I believe that my mother could have passed a polygraph test if asked whether I was my father's biological child. When my son was born, my mother came to Mount Sinai Hospital, which is also where I was born. So it must have been interesting for her to be there. She looked at my baby, my infant in my arms, and she said, "He looks just like a Shapiro." And she wasn't covering anything up. She meant it. I could tell other stories, and I do in the book, about her responses that were very, very strange and sometimes just terrible and hard to understand, that I now understand as the word that I would use is leakage. Leakage of that. She stuffed that knowledge up in a crevasse in her unconscious, where I don't think she ever laid awake at night, ever once losing sleep or thinking about it, but it was there because secrets never go away, and it leaked. It would leak, and it would come out in things that she would say and in her behavior. That's what I think about my mother. I believe, and this is not what I wanted to believe, and it's painful, because I preferred to believe that my father didn't know anything. I believe that my father may not have known at first. He may have bought into the treatment and "you were already pregnant when you got here" idea. But I believe over time, every day I was told that I didn't look Jewish. In my childhood, my father was there. And people would say it to him too. "My God, Paul, look at her." You know, there was an event that I write about in the book where a Holocaust survivor who was friends of my parents, older woman, one grandmother of the future, Jared Kushner, in fact, Mrs. Kushner, patted me on the head. This is in front of my parents, and said, "We could have used you in the ghetto, little blondie. You could have gotten us bread from the Nazis." My father would have been witness to all that. So I believe that my father deeply suspected, knew that I wasn't his biological child. I don't think it mattered at all to him, but I do think he knew.
And maybe that's why you end up feeling about your father the way you did.
Yeah, it wasn't complicated for him. He just loved me.
He just loved you.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which is, well, I don't want to give away too much of the book, but it's very important to follow that storyline in Inheritance. We're going to end my questions to Dani by going from the past to the present. You use a term in your book to describe something that you might face as a massive ethical conundrum. Love it, right? Massive ethical conundrums are what I do for a living. And there are so many of them in Dani's experience. What your biological father owes you. Does he owe you anything now? Do you owe him anything now? What do you owe, if anything, if another half-sibling, yet to be identified, finds you on Ancestry or some other genetic testing site? There's so many questions. Can you say more about what you see as the rights, two parts to this, the rights of donor-conceived children today? That's part one. And can you say something about current practices in donor conception that you think of as still ethically problematic?
I wish we had an hour.
Sorry.
It would not be a spoiler to say I found my biological father. It took 36 hours from the moment that I discovered my dad wasn't my dad to find him, using nothing more than Facebook and Google. It was unusually fast, and some people don't have that story, but that was my story. He was a young medical student at the University of Pennsylvania, and by the time I discovered him, he was a retired physician living in the Pacific Northwest and also a medical ethicist.
I didn't say that part, but it's been driving me crazy ever since trying to figure out who he is. But I won't. I don't do that.
I protected his identity in the book in a variety of ways, but he is a medical ethicist. We had a very delicate back and forth that is a big part of the story that I hope you'll read. But we do end up in each other's lives, and it's given me. I've thought a great. And he has 3 children, and I have met 2 out of 3 of those children, and I'm close now with one of them, who is his oldest, who's a daughter. The other 2 are boys. And she always wanted a sister, and she got one. The question of what is our moral responsibility to each other? What do we owe each other? I think is one that each of us, my biological father and myself, have given a great deal of thought to and have spoken of at length. And I think have thought about independently a lot. And what I've come to is, it would be easy to say, well, nothing. We don't owe each other anything because we didn't know each other. These men and later women donated believing that they would be anonymous, so that should be held to. Why are you getting all, sort of worked up about it? Why, you didn't have to take a DNA test, that kind of thing. I think that the reality is actually quite different. And for the hundreds of thousands of people a year right now who are discovering that they're donor conceived, and those are the numbers, there's a lot of pain. There's a lot of shock. There's a lot of groundlessness. There's a lot of feeling of disorientation, dislocation. There's also the practical matters of medical history. And those people did not ask to be conceived that way. They didn't sign a contract. They weren't aware of anonymity. They didn't ask to be born. And they didn't, in many cases, ask to have these discoveries made. I didn't. I thought I was just doing recreational DNA testing. And that's true for many, many people. The donors who donated anonymously, never imagining this moment happened. So here we are. So the question really then becomes, what do we do, given that here we are? And what I would say, at the barest minimum, what a donor owes biological offspring is medical history. That seems fairly airtight to me. And what I feel that the offspring owe the donor is privacy. This isn't your father. This isn't the person who raised you. This is a stranger who you come from. And there's no really good word for that. There's no playbook for that. So what I would say, and my situation has borne this out, is that what we owe each other is kindness. An understanding that this is an incredibly difficult, unexpected situation that we find ourselves in, and can we be kind? And with that as sort of one of the things that I've seen and I've heard a tremendous about as I've been on the road is that when a family, whether it's someone who was a donor or someone who, a child who's given up for adoption, or it's someone who discovers a half-sibling and doesn't understand, or a man who never knew he had a child, and there's all sorts of permutations of this that are coming up because of DNA testing constantly. When that happens, the first impulse that the family or that person has, the donor, the father, etc., is fear, is being threatened. It's almost, it feels primal to me. What do you want? It's like the primal fear of the other. And I think to counter that feeling, that primal feeling of, nobody's asking to be invited to Thanksgiving dinner. Nobody's asking to, be put into a will. Nobody, very often it's like, what do you want? What do you want? Are you after money? It's very primal. And okay, I'm going to stop now.
I'm sorry. We only have 5 minutes for questions. So, and I apologize for that. Quickly queue up. Maybe we can get 2 or 3 and
okay.
Dani, quick
I'll
answers.
answer quickly.
That would be great.
Lightning round questions.
Yes. We're doing lightning round here.
You mentioned the person who, the elderly woman who conceived.
Yes.
Have you been able to speak with other people of that generation who went through artificial insemination, or has the secrecy been too hard for you to access them?
Many women who conceived this way actually, when they're confronted by their children, say that never happened. And they believe it. So there was tremendous secrecy.
So you haven't been able to really interview them?
No, I have. And some of these parents actually come to my events because there are many parents across America right now who are grappling with the knowledge that their children are going to find out. And they always expected to take the secret to the grave with them, and now they're thinking, well, I could take it to the grave with me, but my child's going to find out, and is that the right thing to do?
Another question.
Hi. You mentioned how that not knowing what you didn't know had an effect on you, and I imagine it had an effect on your self-esteem. And I'd like to hear more about that and how that changed when you found out what you didn't know.
That's a great question. It changed radically. And you're absolutely right that it had a detrimental effect on my self-esteem growing up. But I didn't understand why. And I was able to move through my life and, once I was in my 30s, make some good decisions and like marry the right guy and have a family. And and it made me a writer, actually. I was always digging. Why all these memoirs? So, but I would say regarding that understanding now, and it goes back to that initial question of what good is knowing, all the good in the world, because I feel liberated, and those issues, I know myself, I know where I come from, and I know why all those questions for all those years, so it's changed a lot.
One more ethical question. There are a number of people, because of the advent of DNA testing, who found out their mothers had affairs and that they raised the baby and kept the baby. Is that kind of on the ethical spectrum of the secret being kept? Is it different than the unknown sperm donor?
That's a great question, and I almost want to hand it to Ruth. I mean, I think ultimately it's still a secret that was kept about identity. There's still the same issues of medical history, but it's a different kind of secret.
It's a different kind of secret, and I want Dani to get the last word, but briefly, in the early days of genetic testing, and it still continues when genetic testing is done in a clinical context, the person who's being tested will be told there is always the risk of non-paternity. Do you want to know? Most people, last time I checked the empirical evidence, say no, because their concern is not donor conception. Their concern, their fear is just what you described, right? That it'll dig up all kinds of stuff. Now that evidence, that finding may have changed. It may be now that more people say yes, but that used to be standard practice in genetic counseling for many years. Do you want to?
Yeah. What I would say is that we're in this moment in time, and it's a fascinating moment in time. I think of it as like a seam between all of human history, where many people were raised by men who weren't their fathers. Many fathers raised children that weren't theirs. It was always the case. It's as old as humankind. And now that's over, because of the incredibly powerful 1-2 punch of DNA testing and the internet. And so this is where we are, and I think it's going to keep bioethicists and sociologists and psychologists busy for a very long time as the secrets stop being secret.
And beautiful writers like Dani as well. Please join me again in thanking her.